So I'm getting ready to sew, and I'm just going to be sewing down both sides, only the sides first, and then we'll hem it later. But some things to keep in mind when you're sewing on the bias. You can see here that there's, it's going to want to stretch a little bit, so be sure that if you are using a sewing machine, you feed it very carefully so that your tension doesn't pull it askew. So you can see here, if I stretch it, if I was really pulling at it, it would end up pulling out of shape and actually puckering. And same thing if you accidentally stretched it widthwise, it would end up puckering. So just be sure that you feed it very evenly. In this case, I'm using a stitch length of 3 millimeters, which is pretty appropriate for muslin. But of course, you'll want to maybe test on a little swatch to see, make sure that your stitches are appropriately sized. You can see feeding very slowly. Now you can use a zigzag stitch, or you can use all sorts of different kinds of stitches, but I'm just using a basic straight stitch because that'll hold up really well. And if you're familiar with the technique, you can use a French seam, especially if you were lining with something like a stretch satin, anything that's going to fray. But cottons and heavier woven materials like that, they tend not to fray, so you don't have to worry about that. Well, there's one sewn seam, and as you can see, because I didn't stretch it during the sewing, it still retains the natural stretch of the bias of the fabric. And on the inside, this is actually the outside, it's just a nice, straight, flat, simple seam. So now I'm just going to go and do the other side exactly the same way. Now if you're hand sewing, the same sort of rules apply, where you're going to want to watch your tension, and especially if you're using something like a back stitch, be sure you don't pull your stitches too tight. And I would say using a back stitch or some other sort of stronger stitch than just straight stitching is probably a good idea in the case of hand sewing, because these seams are going to get quite a lot of action. So they're going to need to stretch around you and really have a lot of tension on them as you wear the skirt. So you want to use something that isn't going to shift too much during wearing. Well, now my side seams are sewn. Now it's time to iron down the hems and prepare those for sewing.